Sup, y'all? This is In the Image Clothing Company podcast. That was a little intro with Frank the guitar. My name is Evan Strong, the founder of In the Image Clothing Company. There is three sides to us. The podcast here with discussions on the gospel of Jesus Christ. Our main company side of things is what I call it, which is just the main In the Image Clothing Company with anatomy of the human body and clothing discussions and how to just allow the body to work in everything that we do. And then we also have the other third, which is In the Image Clothing Company Music, which is where you will see Frank the guitar at this current time. Now, little Yamaha CGS 102A half-size guitar, custom radius done by me. So, In the Image Clothing Company is this place here. It's a community, it's a familial place where we're just kind of one big family, just allowing, keyword, the human body to work. We are designed universally in the image of our living God, who is Jesus Christ. That's where the name of our company comes from. That's how the things that we discuss apply to every human across the entirety of our earth and always will. We discuss universal truths that are unchanging, just as our God never changes. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So let's get into this. I will do a little rundown on where clothing needs to sit on every human being, regardless of man, woman, tall, short, skinny, fat, any age, because the human body is about the skeletal system and a natural position. The fat content comes and goes, and the muscle mass does that as well. But the body, just as the body of Christ, I love it so much metaphorical, yet literal at the same time, things within In the Image Clothing Company. We are centered on our foundation and our rock, which is Jesus Christ. Within our physical bodies, we have to have our foundation, the skeletal system, be in its proper, only working position in every aspect of what that means in our own situations, and then we can go from there with anything else we try to do in our lives. So, clothing needs to be entirely above the hips for those pants, off the hips so their ranges of motion in the legs and the hips are just there and unaltered. The waistband needs to be slightly higher in the front of those pants than in the rear, so that those core muscles in our front, in like our stomach, will stay always as they would naturally be activated. That's the center of our body. It would always be turned on and just working with everything to stabilize from there up and from there down. Any other angle of the waistline, that will just not be able to happen. You can't fight something constantly pulling on your pelvis. I can't either. The tops that we wear, the seams on top of our shoulders need to be evenly behind those little bones that are at the edges of our shoulders on top, because that is the other end of our collarbones. That allows our shoulders to be in their neutral position, and ideally right at the very edges for the edge seams of our shoulders is where clothing needs to sit. Button-ups are different. There is a band of material rather than a singular seam on top. They naturally just sit behind your shoulders. So, yes, every single human across the globe, forever, that's how it is. That's how the human skeletal system works. An episode or two of In the Image Clothing Company podcast back, I was discussing how I've been watching a show on the television where they're digging up ancient mummies from 5,000 years ago in Egypt. And these human beings, their bodies are structured the exact same as ours are today. The skeletal system only connects in the way that it does. So, in addition to just allowing clothing to sit naturally on the human body where the skeletal system has its operations, we, as In the Image Clothing Company, have two further things to allow the body to stay unaltered. The first one is our shoelacing technique, because it's the only technique of lacing a rope in shoes that doesn't alter the foot shape of a natural human being's skeletal structure within the foundational beginnings, which is our feet. With that technique included is to tie the shoes evenly over toward the inside to create an even foundation to the center of our bodies that travels up from there through the rest of our bodies. Now, secondly, our other prerequisite is to remove all tags from within clothing. Anywhere a tag is placed inside of our clothing, it's causing a gap and changing the body's natural workings to a great degree, included within the shoes. Remove those as well, because that will either potentially affect the dorsiflexion or plantar flexion of our ankles, or those natural gripped arches that are within our feet. So let's get into this. In the Image Clothing Company podcast, episode 48. This is titled Vices. Now, little rundown, a little definition in a sense of what a vice is. That's silly because multiple vice would be vices. All right, so a vice is, see, that's silly. That's actually so funny. What a vice is something that holds on to something else. Within like a workshop, like if you're working in a wood shop, yes. If you're within a shop and working with wood and you're trying to clamp wood down to hold it into place to do something, to either just make it really secure so you can cut it, or you're going to put glue between two pieces of wood and squish it together and you want it to be held really tightly together, you put it within what's called a vise. It's this thing that will squeeze together tightly and hold on to that wood. Now, vices talk about a lot of things being metaphoric as well as extremely literal within the Image Clothing Company. Here we go, right? A vice can be literally grasping, like my hands together right now. They're like viced together, if you will. But a vice can also be metaphorically something that we are kind of being held by, and in a not so good way, right? As in like a grasp that we feel like we can't let go of. And there's a lot of things that we can label as vices. Things like, well, there's an episode of In the Image Clothing Company podcast titled Dependence. It's one of the first 10 or 20 within those episodes, somewhere in there. And within that episode, I talked about, being dependent on things that we feel that we have to like have, and like we're holding tight to these things that we know we don't need. Very similar. But a vice is something that I'm going to get into like depth within this in multiple ways, more than just like a dependence on something, because I'll explain it to where this is going to make a lot of sense, and it's going to actually be a lot of ahas in a sense. Like people will be like, whoa, okay, now I see why this is happening so much and why I keep going back to this thing and I don't even want to, but somehow I feel drawn to it. Okay, here we go. Because a lot of times these vices are things that we're not aware of why we're dependent on, and we don't feel like we're going to them, but we feel like it just ends up happening. This is something that's going to be cool. Here's a capo. Oh goodness, I just hit Frank the guitar's body on the frame of this here bed. So this is a capo for a guitar, okay? Very similar to a vice, right? You open up the clamp and you close it, and it pinches what's between the clamped part, and there it is. It's like, that's essentially what a vice is, something that just holds on to something else. Now, I'm going to keep this in my hand for at least a little bit throughout this episode of In the Image Clothing Company podcast, episode 48, titled Vices. Check this out. When we do things in our lives continually for like an extended period of time, and it's something that we're doing that's like creating a patterning, right? Like what we talk about within the human body. On the main side of In the Image Clothing Company, we have our Universal Patternings series, where I discuss things within the body that are patternings that our bodies do get into, regardless of, as I say, any part of the earth that you live on or any time period that we live in. Just because we're human beings, and the way that our bodies interact with things that are around us, like oversized clothing, imbalances within clothing, or things in our lives that we are using one side of our bodies more than the other to do, things like that, we get into these patternings. And I'm going to discuss something that's kind of only relative to this time in our existence as human beings, because as I talk about, I don't like to discuss technology very often because it always changes. The way that the actual devices are shaped and structured, and the ways that we approach them, and the amount of time that we spend doing with the things that we do within and on these things change, and they always will. And I like to discuss universal truths that don't ever change. But something that we can relate to in this time period right now, I told you the date, is our cell phones, our modern smartphones. people are so addicted, quote unquote, to those. But as I was saying, a vice is a little bit different than a dependence in the sense of we don't really know a lot of times why we're even going back to our cell phones. We will grab our phone and open it up. A lot of times that's the first thing we do when we sit down as human beings in this time period. People will go and sit down on a chair and immediately pull their cell phone out of their pocket and look at it, but they don't have any idea of why. I'll tell you why. This is not my opinion. As I say, don't believe me. Evan Strong, as the founder of In The Image Clothing Company, with the things that I discuss, but just listen to what I'm saying because we discuss universal truths and it will manifest itself within you. So, sinful by nature, though. This guy, me, Evan Strong speaking, as all of us human beings are. So, when we are using a cell phone in this time period, again, this is something that won't always be this way, definitely not, and I think so much sooner than we could imagine it will change the way that the device is structured and the way that we approach using them, and I think that's something that will also be kind of an aha. A lot of people will be like, whoa, what the? I didn't realize how much of a vice these cell phones were, and then it only lasted however many decades, right? It's only been about a decade and a half, give or take, at this point that we've had them the way that they are. So when we hold a cell phone and we're doing what we're doing on it, our wrist is entirely in a terribly out of its neutral position. If you're watching this episode of In the Image Clothing Company podcast in visual plus audio, you can see this. If you're just looking in, you wouldn't be. If you're just listening in audio only, then you can imagine what I'm saying. Straight out from our forearm is our pinky, and that is the neutral wrist. As like I'm saying, if you're watching, you can see I'm setting my arm as if it were to be placed on the bottom of the frame, even though there's actually not anything there. That is our neutral wrist, out from the pinky, and you travel from the end of our pinky finger to the elbow, and that's just basically one straight line, okay? When you're using a cell phone, you are entirely out of that neutral position of the wrist, and you're like here, okay? Very, very altered with the wrist angle, and the fingers are in a very unnatural angle where they can't even actually bend in that position. The thumb is doing things that are so unnatural. And we spend as human beings in this time period, again, this will change very quickly, a lot of time in that position. Now, what happens is we train a patterning. I've talked so often about, because of clothing, things like uneven shoe tying, oversized shirts, the dreaded collar seam that I always discuss that we have our modification for under In The Image Clothing Company, things like that, and just uneven seams that are twisted and stitched imbalanced that are rotating the entire body will cause a lot of bound up muscle on the exterior of this right arm. Okay, the muscle adheres to this bone because if you're not in the neutral wrist position where the fingers can just close in line, but what I'm saying right now is only within clothing. There's a lot of things that play into the same position that is very similar to how we're holding cell phones nowadays in this time period. So this is what I talk about when I say that these patternings are because of clothing. They're furthered because of our modern technology in this time period, but that will change. The patternings that we're in, though, just maybe to a lesser extent because they're not being so deeply ingrained to the extent of a cell phone if we don't have those things. But the patternings have been around for as long as they have, just because that's what clothing is doing. Just an oversized top alone, which is something that people even in the Egyptian time 5,000 years ago, pyramid age and before and things, even those times, like I was mentioning just because I was talking about that, right? They'd have the same exact patterning going on because of just an oversized tunic or shawl or anything in the desert of Egypt with sand. Same thing. So the cell phone is not what's causing it, but it could be furthering the ingrained pattern. And it is if you're using it with an extended period of time in a very unnatural position. So let's talk about this though. What's happening is you're getting used to this, but you can't. You can't get used to something that's not the only normal the body has, which is the neutral wrist out from the pinky. So why you pull your cell phone out immediately, don't let me tell you something, but this is the truth. The reason that happens right when you sit down is because that's the position you have spent so much time in while you sit down, to where your body has been used to that position, but not used to it in a way that's actually okay and it's used to it, so it's fine now, but used to it as in That's the position it's had to try to work around because you're using something like that. But that doesn't mean the body can do that, because the body doesn't even do this. The body doesn't even use a cell phone the way that most people's are structured and shaped. And I have a video under the main site of In the Image Clothing Company titled How Cell Phones Affect Body Mechanics. And I went over that and how we need a little bit of rounding to the rear of the phone because our hands are round, and it needs to be as thin as we can get it because our hands need to touch, right? The thumb needs to touch all the fingers. Otherwise, we create a quote-unquote new normal that's not normal, but what our body is trying to use as normal, which is farther than touching its own fingertips together. And the phone needs to be very small so that the thumb doesn't have to go excessively out of its only ranges of motion to try to operate the device. Now, what's happening is we're doing that, though, even though the human body doesn't even actually do it. No human being, even very, very large hands, don't, because of just alone the fact that the rear of it is flat and the hands are not. The fingers do not come flat. They're rounded. The hand is round. So what happens is our bodies have been deeply ingrained into an imbalance to where that's how they know that they sit now, right? But it's the same thing, like I'm saying, as having your shoes tied unevenly toward the same direction being the right. In a right-handed knot, 85%, give or take, of the population of the earth are right-handed. They'd be tying their shoes to the right if they're not tying them evenly, as we discuss within one of our 2 prerequisites under In the Image Clothing Company, okay? Centered. Now, so that's what I mean, is it's not determined by cell phones, it's only furthered by them. And it is, to quite a degree, because of how unnatural they are. But so the human being can't actually sit nowadays in 2025 centered for many reasons. And so what you'll do is pull that phone out and immediately put it in your hand because your body's so uncomfortable trying to sit at least semi-centered, semi-vertical, because we're on our cell phones sitting down, looking to the right and looking down and having our right arm entirely externally rotated, completely flat with the fingers. Neutral wrist is completely out of its only neutral normal position, and the thumb is so inhibited. The pinky and the pointer finger are being pressed backward in line with the other fingers when they do not work in that position. So the body doesn't even know how to operate, and it just can't because there's bound up scar tissue all throughout, especially just mostly the right side of it, because of these things. Again, clothing alone, the cell phone only furthers the patterning. Now, yeah, that's why it immediately gets pulled out of your pocket and put into your hand, even if you don't know what you're going to do on it or what you could even do on it. Because then you sometimes, I know out of personal experience, and I've seen others do this, you'll just kind of like scroll around and try to find something to maybe do. And you're like, well, why did I even pull this out? Here's another thing. You're walking through life and you're nervous. I made a video one time for the main company side of In the Image Clothing Company titled How Clothing Causes Anxiety. Not that it necessarily causes it, in certain ways, yes, but really what it does is further it and keep us deeper into these patternings, because similar thing to this, right? I mean, you're walking around and what you've done with holding something in such an imbalanced position for your body out of your center line is trained your breathing patterns. We have a episode of In the Image Clothing Company podcast titled Oxygen. It's one of the past few episodes here within the number of 40s of episodes. And I discussed how we're always breathing, always, as human beings. That's what is our like first physical way of making sure that we're alive, is breath. And when you are breathing, you're training the entire body into a patterning because it takes the entire body to some degree to breathe, whether it's stabilizing or actually moving things to expand the rib cage. The entire body is used in breathing. Now, when we're holding a cell phone for X amount of time, we are training our breathing into that position through the whole body. And what happens then is when we get a little bit scared or anxious, usually we start to breathe a little bit deeper. our heart rate starts to elevate a little bit, and we start to like raise our shoulders a little bit, because that's how you're going to breathe deeper, is by getting those shoulders up and out of the way and those scapulas to expand your rib cage. Now, if we've spent so much time looking at a cell phone in such an unnatural position, that will become the position that our bodies are the most used to breathing in, and especially associated with being stressed, because it's very stressful for the body. Even if you're like doing something quite peaceful on your phone, the position the body is in is under a lot of physical stress to try to even operate out of such an imbalance. So what happens is you'll be walking down the street or wherever you are, or sitting or standing, and somebody starts to make some kind of conversation around you or to you, and you get a little bit nervous, or you're like passing somebody as you're walking and you don't want to look at them, and so what you do is pull out your phone. But again, why? I don't have anything to do at this current moment, we're saying to ourselves, but I pulled out my phone and I don't know why. The reason why you did is because you started breathing heavier, and associating that with the little bit of nervousness you feel just because you don't know who this human being is that's in whatever the situation is coming up. And that's fine to be a little bit nervous. We go through emotions as human beings. But what ends up happening then is when you start breathing and getting into that stressful feeling within the body, it will go into the patterning that it's used to while within that type of vice, being holding a cell phone. Okay? Vice meaning the body has literally been conditioned to hold this pattern, because again, it's so unnatural to do, holding the modern devices that we have at this time period that will change so soon. I'm not trying to like predict the future. I'm just saying we're so blinded by what it is, and they're changing. They have changed quite a lot within the past 15-ish years that we've had them, but the speed at which they will be nowhere near how they are now. I'm not trying to like predict anything. That's not what I'm doing. I just trying to like show it as it is. They're just going to change so quickly to where this just won't quite apply to our everyday doings pretty soon, right? But the patternings and things will apply forever. And then this will be a cool thing to reflect back onto as well. So yes. Now, so you'll have your own body being a vice to itself, as far as the muscles out here on the exterior of this right forearm and the whole right side of the body, right? The right scapula is in a weird position, and the right upper trap is like pulling on the base of the skull because it's so like out of its only working position to just contract in line. And the lower right rear of the pelvis, where that the latissimus dorsi comes down and connects into the base of the spine and the upper crest of the pelvis. Those positions, the outer part of the right leg. But again, same exact parts of the body that happen within uneven shoe tying toward the right, rather than evenly over toward the inside how it needs to be. But just furthered, because you're already in external rotation on that right side because of clothing patterning, if there were no such thing as cell phones. Okay? So that's what vices are, as far as the way that we're discussing them within this episode of In the Image Clothing Company podcast. And that's the real reason why you just pull out your phone at random times and you don't really know why. And then you're like questioning yourself as far as like, what was I even doing? We do that. I've done it many, many times. I don't do it now because the position that I hold my cell phone in isn't unnatural now. Just because I make sure of that. I'm very intentional to put something small and a little bit like rounded on the rear in the center of the phone. And my phone is basically the smallest one that I can even get nowadays that's close to as functional as the modern ones, So yeah, anyway, that's what vices really are. So the capo here, good example because it's a little clamp, right? And that's what's happening, is we're getting clamped into these positions, into these patternings, into these things that we just go to. And the reason we go to them is just because it's something that we have created as a patterning. There might be no desire in any part of you to pull out your cell phone in these times that you're doing it, but you don't know why, and it just seems to happen. It's because of a patterning. It's not even you. It's just something that's come to be. Tightness that's that's been created, tension that's been created. And that's really what it is. So that's the thing with these vices of us human beings is no matter what it is, because even something like, let me be very clear. If I'm talking about things, I'm not trying to condemn people because we all have our sins and mistakes. I've got some things that I've definitely been addicted to throughout my life, things that I've been definitely going back to and that I never should have gone to in the first place. So I'm not condemning, but I'm going to mention a few things because something like smoking, again, even if it was not doing anything as far as breathing in what's coming through whatever you're smoking, if that wasn't actually doing anything at all to you, but it was just like a little stick. You have a stick that's the size or shape of whatever you're holding to your lips to smoke. And that's exactly what you were doing, is just putting that stick there. And it wasn't actually doing anything chemically within your body or anything within your respiratory system at all. Just the position of holding your fingers up to your mouth and your arm in that position and breathing in that position, training a patterning in that position. It's a physical thing within your body. So then when you're not smoking, if it's something you're doing really often, then your body is going to try to just go into this habitual patterning because it's created muscle memory. It's like Frank the guitar here. There's been many months since I started playing guitar until now that I haven't played at all. And then I can pick up a guitar and play it as if I'd never set it down. That can happen with any kind of instrument. That can happen within sports. Anything that the body does physically because of the reasons we discuss patternings within In the Image Clothing Company. The body knows what is done before. It has that, like I worded, muscle memory to it. The sensory system of the body keeps this memory of what it needs to do, how it needs to fire the nervous system and things, right, from the brain through the spinal cord, all throughout the body is our nervous system. And it keeps track of the movements that we do, like playing guitar. And so, well, like holding a cell phone, like smoking a cigarette or whatever it is that you're smoking. Ideally don't, but I'm not condemning, right? I mean, so many things that ideally I shouldn't do either, but I still do. We're human beings. We're sinful by nature, as I mentioned toward the beginning of this episode of In the Image Clothing Company podcast. Episode 48, titled Vices. So yeah, this is what I'm talking about. It doesn't matter what it is because it could be a good thing. As far as playing guitar is a good thing, but the body remembers it. And so, yeah, what can happen though is even if it's a good thing, like playing guitar, if it's set up poor and my body, okay, I'm not going to say an if, we're going to have a little bit of personal experience talk for a second. I've had 19 guitars before Frank the guitar here, like I've mentioned in past episodes of In the Image Clothing Company podcast, and as well as other places within In the Image Clothing Company in general. Within those guitars, so many of them were set up so terribly and strung so terribly that my body got physically viced, is how I'm going to word it. As far as very similar to what I'm saying with the cell phone, right? Bound up scar tissue and muscle throughout parts that are nowhere near my fingertips, which is what I use to play the guitar. And so that stuck with me, and that was essentially like a vice. And so what would happen a lot of the time is I felt like I couldn't put the guitar down, but it was driving me insane. And the reason is because my body was ingrained to being stuck within the position that it was in playing a poorly set up guitar, to where it drove me nuts because that's pain physically within the body doing that. But setting it down, my body almost craved it because it's stuck into that pattern. And so that's the only position that it can like be in. It can't release from that vice. So that's a beautiful full circle back to just, well, fully explaining what I've been talking about up until this point within this episode of In the Image Clothing Company podcast. So that's really what's happening when we're doing things physically like that we don't understand why we keep going back to. And it feels like there's not even a desire within us, but it's something that we just can't seem to like. It's like this, like it's like you're trying to pull it away from you and it just like keeps snapping back at you. That's what I mean when I'm discussing vices within this episode here of In the Image Clothing Company podcast. So I'm actually going to wrap it up because that's exactly what I was trying to get across, and I'm grateful immensely for how it was relayed. That was awesome. I'm the one saying that. If you don't think so, hey, cool, go somewhere else. But I'm grateful. So that was really just what I wanted to be saying within this. So we are In the Image Clothing Company. We will have clothing available made out of 100% natural materials, staying centered, fitting correct, allowing the body to work. If you ever purchase In the Image Clothing Company clothing, don't. If your intent is to purchase it oversized, do not go buy somebody else's stuff. Do not buy ours if it's going to be oversized for you. Do all that you can to get it in your size. That's the whole goal. The goal is natural. The only way we're going to allow the human body to work is if clothing is fitting it in the best way that we can do in our own situations. So, as I mentioned, today is the 27th of January, 2025. My name is Evan Strong, the founder of In the Image Clothing Company, and thank you for checking out In the Image Clothing Company podcast. Goodbye.